You're listening to episode number 5 of Overprescribed. Welcome to Overprescribed, the show that raises America's awareness on pharmaceutical medications in this country, all in an effort to help you, the everyday consumer, to live the safest, healthiest, and most informed medication experience possible. Hi everyone, it's Mika, and I am thrilled to have you tune in to yet another episode of the show. We're up to episode number 5 now, which is really exciting, and we have some really cool episodes coming up over the next month that I really want you to tune into. On today's show, we're really going to focus on a topic that I actually find quite interesting, quite controversial, and it deals with race and ethnicity. Before I really get into the show and the meat of the show, I want to share some personal things with you. So for those that don't know me, I'm a 41-year-old African-American woman who's pretty much, I guess you could say, have done everything I was supposed to do in life. I've been a responsible citizen of the U.S. I followed societal rules and expectations generally. I've pursued higher education, contributed to the economy, participated in the workforce. I've paid my taxes. But yet there's something going on with prescription medications, well, a lot going on that I just frankly can't ignore. And actually, I'm a little bit offended that it's even occurring. And what's that? Well, it has to do with the patient populations that are participating in clinical trials all over the country every day, right now. It has to do with the diversity or lack thereof in clinical patient populations. It's complicated, and I'm not sure I'll do the best job in laying it all out in this one episode alone, but I'm going to do my best to at least scratch the surface for you. So when it comes to researching a drug to find out if it's going to be successful, normally meaning it's going to be safe and effective, researchers spend money recruiting physician offices, where a physician will normally serve as the principal investigator, or PI for short, of his or her site. And in research, we refer to these places that will participate as sites. So at these sites, it's expected that the PI and or their staff at the site will approach specific patients who they deem eligible based on the study protocol to invite them to participate. This does not mean that everyone who seems to be eligible will be asked to participate. It's really up to the physician and their staff to inform subjects or potential subjects and patients that they interact with. And it also doesn't mean that everyone who is approached will truly be eligible or even interested. Now, these potential subjects may even have to go through some screening tests that may include certain laboratory tests or exams to ensure they really are the right patients based on the study protocol requirements. And just about every study has problems recruiting patients. And so a huge part of research clinical operations, which is what my background is in, is devoted to tracking subject recruitment and figuring out ways to improve it in order to meet certain timeline targets and whatever predetermined minimum total subject goal for that study. So now what's happening in the US is that the drugs are being approved by the FDA with no way of knowing if there are any racial or ethnic differences. And while this doesn't mean that every drug has a different reaction in an individual depending on their race or ethnicity, it is significant because there can be differences in how the drug reacts to an individual. And we covered a little bit of this and the reasons for that in episode number 3 when we touched on pharmacogenetics and pharmacogenomics. And if you just looked at the FDA drug approvals for new or novel medications or biologics for 2017 and 2018, when it comes to gender, we seem to be doing okay, recruiting a good mix of men and women if you look at the data. And even with 55% of female subjects being represented in 2017 data for new and novel meds, drug approvals. But when you're looking at the details to drill down to the racial and ethnic makeup of clinical data that led to an FDA approval for a given drug, things start to become a little bit more troubling. So, for example, also in 2017, when looking at the subgroups for 46 novel drugs that were approved per the FDA as new molecular entities or under a new drug application that was submitted by a pharma company, that grand total was about 59,030 patients. Again, that led to those 46 individual drug approvals. And within those patients, if you look at the racial ethnicity spread, demographically, those patients were represented as 77% were white, 11% Asian, 7% Black or African American, and 14% identify as Hispanic. Now, if you take that and you compare it to what U.S. Census data estimates showed in 2015, you're looking at this. You're looking at 77% white, which is actually almost smack dab on based on the 46 new drug approvals in 2017. But you're also looking at Asians representing 5.6% of the U.S. population, even though they made up 11% of those new drug approval trial patient populations. And you're looking at 13% of Black or African American representation in this country, even though there was only 7% of Black or African American across the grand total of demographics for 2017 new drug approvals. And then lastly, in terms of Hispanic identification, the Census Bureau estimated 17% of Hispanics in the U.S. for 2015 versus the 14% that were identified across the new drug approvals for 2017. So when looking at the grand total in 2017, and I'm talking about that 56,000 or so patient number, it appears that we're pretty spot on in terms of the representations of the race and ethnic groups, with recruiting more Asians in terms of percentage when comparing to percentage of Asians living in America. But with Black and African American patients, there is an underrepresentation. Okay, so I've read more than once that the Black or African American underrepresentation can be attributed to mistrust in that population when it comes to participating in clinical trials. And some of this mistrust has largely been attributed to what happened in the Tuskegee syphilis study. And you may have heard of it, but if you haven't, this was the very well-known or infamous study where over 400 Black men between 1932 and 1972 were intentionally withheld treatment for their syphilis, even when penicillin became available in the 40s, so that the researchers of that study over many decades could see the normal progression of the disease, which was ultimately catastrophic on those men and their families. And this mistrust reason is very interesting to me because I don't think it applies to the vast majority of Black people in all circumstances if they were approached to participate in a clinical trial today. Also, if it is the mistrust of a healthcare provider asking you to participate in a clinical trial that worries you, then what if that healthcare provider looks like you and it maybe is of the same race or ethnicity? Regardless of if you're African American or Black or not. Well, it has been noted for some research, and this is why I'm mentioning it, it has been noted that if we have more diversity in our principal investigators or the physicians who are running these clinical trials and recruiting patients to participate, then those physicians could get more patients of diversity in their studies because those patients may trust someone like them who looks more like them, who's more culturally like them, a whole lot more than someone who's not. And I can tell you that as a Black or African American woman, yes, I can understand that. So for example, in the Black community, if we know of an African American doctor, especially if he or she has a good reputation, we tend to flock to that person and tell all of our friends and family to do the same. So this notion of more diverse physicians will bring in more diverse patients seems to have some merit, right? Well, I'd say yes and no. And I say no because then it brings up an issue that I have observed in some of my own trials in the past, some of my own research studies, where we had very little diversity in our physicians representing U.S. sites. As a matter of fact, I remember once attending an investigator meeting to kick off the start of this major trial. And when I started to meet and greet with all the physicians who were flown in around the country to attend this really important meeting, out of the 50 or 60 physicians participating in the trial, agreeing to bring in a certain number of their patients as subjects on the study, there were really just a small handful of doctors who weren't white. I think we had about four Asian physicians, and maybe one or two Black physicians at the most. Those low numbers could easily be attributed to the pharmaceutical company that ultimately approves which physicians make it in the trial, but who knows? Maybe some of that could even speak to the diversity of physicians coming out of our medical schools, period. Physicians graduating from medical schools with certain specialties. And also physicians who participate in clinical trials start to gain a reputation of being really good recruiters or great participants or champions of support for certain pharmaceutical companies. And so some are asked to participate in certain trials with the company over and over and over and over again, possibly leaving very little slots for new physician sites, brand new physician investigators to join trials and to participate with certain pharmaceutical companies. So those are other reasons why you may not see some diversity. And let me also tell you a story that portrays a scenario on how this diversity problem may also exist. So I remember working on a consulting firm as the North American lead for a very large global study. And one day I was approached by a study team member who brought something to my attention that one of our US-based physician sites had about 6 patients to recruit who seemed really interested in the study, and they seemed to meet the initial eligibility requirements. But in order to bring them into the study, the physician needed study funds to pay to translate the informed consent form for this group of 6 patients who were of Haitian background. So the informed consent form is mandatory. Patients have to review this. You have to review this with them, and they have to sign that they agree to participate in the trial. And my first thought was that 6 patients for one site was a very nice number, because we actually had a ton of sites in the study who were only expected to bring in maybe 1 or 2 patients max. And in my second thought, as a woman of color, was, and knowing that the study overall needed more diversity, was a huge yes, let's do this. I was very excited to move in this direction to, get the funds approved so we can have this informed consent translated for this group of 6 Haitian patients. On these studies, it's not uncommon to translate informed consent forms all the time, even though, given the fact that, Spanish is the second most popular language here in the U.S., we tend to do more Spanish translations. But the point is that, on a global scale, we're translating informed consents all the time. So here's the problem. I wasn't prepared at all for what happened next. Even though the translations weren't going to cost a lot of money in comparison to what was being spent on this study, the request was denied. While my pharmaceutical counterpart agreed with me that we should approve these funds and get these patients in the study, another person on my very own team at the same company that I worked for, who outranked me, went above my head to their pharmaceutical counterpart to overturn the decision, and then went on to email me, with others copied, on the email thanking me for the effort, but this will not be approved due to costs or time factors, and the decision was final and we'll be moving on. And I was really disheartened by this. And to this day, I look at it as one of the possibly many reasons, unique reasons, that are never shared publicly as to why the diversity problem in clinical trial patient volunteers exists. It's not always the patient's fault, is my point. And maybe most of the time it's not the patient's fault. And as someone who has worked in research, I think it's beyond time to stop making it the patient's fault. There are people of all races and ethnicities at companies around this country who support diversity and want to make it happen. But sometimes there are reasons like costs that are thrown out there as to why diversity is not happening. Sometimes people don't want to put together a unique recruiting strategy for a particular group. They want to put in or implement a one-size-fits-all. And that also impacts diversity in clinical patients. Regardless of the reasons there, some racial or ethnic subgroups are grossly underrepresented. And I took a look at the new drug approvals for 2018 to see how much that underrepresentation stands as of today for individual drug approvals. So not looking at the grand cumulative total for a particular period of time. I went over to the FDA's Drug Snapshots page. I scrolled down to the wonderful table they have embedded right there and have captured in one of their drug snapshot pages and sorted by the date of FDA approval to zero in on just the drugs for 2018 approval. Now, before I get into what I found, let me tell you a little bit about these drug snapshots, just in case you weren't aware of them. So these drug snapshots are for us, the consumers. And these summaries or snapshots of a drug are meant to share with consumers transparently what the diversity of clinical trial participants was and to what degree the drug was determined to be safe and effective for demographic subgroups. So race, sex, and age are often addressed in these drug snapshots. These drug snapshots came about after the 2012 Food and Drug Administration Safety and Innovation Act. And while I find these snapshots a step in the right direction, there are limitations that even the FDA points out right on their website. So I'm going to quote this. So, quote, "The snapshot is intended as one tool for consumers to use when discussing a drug's risk and benefits with their physicians. Do not rely on snapshots alone to make decisions regarding medical care. Do not use snapshots to substitute for advice from your healthcare professional. Conclusions regarding how effective and safe a drug is among different sex, race, and age groups cannot always be made, often because the numbers of patients in some groups are too limited to allow for meaningful comparisons to other groups and to the overall results," end quote. So speaking of those numbers, let's go into that. I found 9 new drugs approved in 2018 so far, and all but one had this statement regarding race. Quote, "The majority of patients were white. The number of patients in other races was limited. Therefore, differences in response among races could not be determined," end quote. And I have to tell you, to read something like that, 8 times makes you wonder, then why approve this drug? Why approve a drug when we know certain health conditions affect different races and ethnicities differently or more often? Why approve a drug when we know that there could be biologic responses to a drug that are different for one group versus another? Knowing that history has shown this and knowing that the future of these newly approved drugs could reveal the same thing once it's exposed to millions of people versus the hundreds of people that were exposed in a clinical trial. Why not just be 100% sure all the time about how a drug will react for all people? Frankly, it seems irresponsible to approve a drug without knowing for certain who it will and who it will not help. But sadly, this is a state that we're in and we have been in for decades. Years ago, I worked on a study for a drug that was already on the market. It was FDA approved, and it appeared that based on safety reports coming into the FDA, the drug may have been harming one racial group more than all others. And the FDA mandated that that pharmaceutical company complete post-marketing surveillance and report back with the results, which is where the company I was working for came into play because we were hired by the pharma company to conduct the research with them. In the end, it was ultimately determined that there was a difference that was statistically significant. So I know that these differences do exist. And if you look close enough at drug labels, news reports, published research studies, you'll eventually see the same thing. Now, for these new drugs approved in 2018, I wanted to share some of the numbers with you, and I want you to tell me what you think may be too low or too high. So let's go ahead into the specific list, and I'm going to pull out my sheets of paper here, so you may hear a little crinkling in the background because I have a lot of detail to share. So let's start with the first drug on my list. So Akynzeo is the drug. It's a drug for the treatment of nausea and vomiting for a group of patients who have cancer. The company that manufactures this drug, research it, is called Helsinn Healthcare. Helsinn, HELSINN, as in Nancy. And according to the drug Snapshots, Akynzeo was approved by the FDA based primarily on two separate trials. Trial 1 was used to establish the benefits of Akynzeo, and that enrolled 440 patients receiving chemotherapy. The trial was conducted in 9 countries. None of those countries actually were in the U.S. And then trial 2 was used to establish side effects of Akynzeo, and that included 404 patients, which was considered to be a safety population receiving chemotherapy. And that trial was conducted in 11 countries, one of which was in the U.S. According to the drug snapshot for Akynzeo, the first trial, trial 1, or the efficacy group, were considered to be all white population. So 100%. And the trial 2 population was considered to be 401 subjects identified as white, 1 as Asian, and 2 as Black or African American. Another drug goes by the name Crysvita, Crysvita, and this is a drug used for the treatment of a genetic form of rickets called X-linked hypophosphatemia in patients 1 year of age or older. It's manufactured by Ultragenyx Pharmaceutical, and this was a trial, or this study that led to the FDA approval, also displayed here a majority of white patients with differences in race unable to be determined. The breakdown was 83% white, 3% Black, 11% Asian, and 3% identifying as other. The drug Tavalisse, Tavalisse, is used for the treatment of low platelet count and chronic immune thrombocytopenia patients. It's manufactured by a company, it looks like Rigel, Rigel Pharmaceutical. And their breakdown was, again, another one where differences could not be determined. Majority white. Breakdown was white patients made 93% of the trial, Asian and Black patients at 3%, and then 1% identify as other. Ilumya is a drug for the treatment of moderate to severe plaque psoriasis. So yes, another drug on the market to treat moderate to severe plaque psoriasis. Of course, it's not a curative treatment, as psoriasis cannot be cured theoretically. But anyway, it's just drug. The manufacturer is Merck Sharp and Dohme Corporation, DOHME. Not sure how to pronounce that one. And this one here, same thing, majority white, no differences in patients. Another drug for 2018 new drug approval is called Trogarzo. And this is a drug used for the treatment of HIV-1 in adults. Its manufacturer simply goes by the name Thera, at least per the FDA's website. And patient breakdown for Trogarzo was interesting. According to this one, the trial was too small to tell if there were any sex, race, age, or racial differences. As the trial only had 40 patients. The corporation or manufacturer for this is TaiMed Biologics USA Corp. TaiMed spelled TAIM as in Mike, ED as in David. And the study population was pulled from the US as well as Taiwan. And per an FDA announcement on March 6th of this drug approval, and this drug did receive fast track, priority review, breakthrough therapy designation, plus orphan drug status. So a lot of special things push this particular drug through to approval. Another drug, Erleada, ERLEADA, is a drug for the treatment of prostate cancer that is not spread to other parts of the body. So non-metastatic prostate cancer. Of course, the gender for this is going to be 100% male. Manufacturer is Janssen Biotech Incorporated, and their demographic breakdown in terms of race and ethnicity was also very interesting. It was determined that it worked the same. The drug worked the same in all patients, even though over 1,000 patients, 800 were identified as white, 68 identified as Black, 140 identified as Asian, and then 199 others. So somehow, despite those numbers where there is clearly a majority of patients in one category, somehow they've determined that the drug works the same in all patient populations. There's a drug also called Symdeko. Make sure I'm pronouncing this right. Symdeko. Yeah. Symdeko, SYM as in Mike, D as in Dave, EKO is for the treatment of cystic fibrosis. Manufacturer is Vertex Pharmaceuticals. And for Symdeko, again, majority white, difference is unable to be determined. Breakdown was 891 white patients, only 7 patients identified as Black or African American, only 2 identified as Asian, and only 16 identified as other. So here it is. We have a drug. Here is vast majority white patient population. And then the last one on the list for 2018 is a drug. Make sure I get this name right. Lutathera, and that's spelled Lutathera. Lutathera is a drug for the treatment of adults who have a specific type of tumor called gastroenteropancreatic neuroendocrine tumor, or GEP-NET for short, according to the drug Snapshot here on the FDA website. And these NETs, or neuroendocrine tumors, are rare tumors that develop in certain hormone-producing cells of the body. When we look at the demographic spread for this one here, it looks like this was also one where it was determined that most patients were white, and differences in how well the drug worked among races could not be determined because of the small number of patients in other races. And if you look at the specific numbers, according to the data on the drug Snapshot page, when it came to the trial that led to the FDA approval for this year, there were 188 patients classified as white, 10 patients classified as Black or African American, 1 patient classified as Asian, 9 patients classified as other, and 21 patients classified as missing, which I actually need to look into what that means, but that's an interesting category. I assume that they weren't able to get any information on those particular patients. So I don't know how this diversity problem is ever going to be fixed when drugs are allowed to be approved with a lack of diversity all the time. And privately funded trials aren't mandated to ensure some minimum degree of racial and ethnic representation in the same way that a government-funded trial it may need to follow, for example. But I do know that we as consumers need to start demanding better, and we need to make it happen. If it costs more to recruit diverse patients, then every drug company should add that to their budget, and I'm sure some are. But the new drug approvals on the FDA's website doesn't really tell us that story, does it? I want all drugs to be acceptable for all of us, or for us to know how that drug will react for all of us. I have young children, and I want to know that when my children grow older and they have their own children, that their children and generations beyond that can take a medication knowing that it's not going to cause severe harm or be completely ineffective or a waste of time and money. So I know we need to do better, and I think we can. Okay, so that was today's show. Thank you so much for listening. And I just want to let you know that if you go to our homepage or our website, overprescribedpodcast.com, as always, within the episode posting for this show, I will include really helpful show note links for you. A lot of things that I refer to in this show I'll include, and I may even include a few bonus links for you too to share as resources. And I want to do something I've never done before on the show, and that is to encourage you to visit our Facebook page. That's right, the Overprescribed Podcast is on Facebook. We're not doing a whole lot there just yet, but we would love for you to come join us in that community and like our page and share with your friends and family. And we even have a private closed Facebook group for consumers to unite and to get to know each other and to share resources and really bond through that as well. So check us out on Facebook. And until next time.